Welcome back, everybody. Today's episode on 10,000 Heroes is an interview with John Giuliano, and this is going to be very different. It is very long. It's the longest interview I've done. It's over 90 minutes, which for me is a long time because normally I like to be a little more to the point, but I'll explain why in a second. So John Giuliano, one of my biggest mentors, one of my biggest teachers. You've probably never heard of him, but he's a true real-life hero. And he doesn't often talk about himself or his background. That's just part of his thing. And I got him to do it. So I'm proud of that. And I think it's going to be of benefit to everybody who knows him and everybody who doesn't and who really wants to understand a little bit more about the anatomy of this incredibly powerful and beautiful human being. Because John gets something on a fundamental level that most of us don't, which is that we're actually one. And not in a philosophical sense, but when we're serving, there's no subject and no object. There's no giver and no receiver. There's no such thing as selfishness and altruism because the ground for those concepts doesn't even exist. So we can selflessly serve while that being a perfect expression of who we are. So it's a beautiful, beautiful example, like 60-year life example of everything I'm trying to talk about. And it's inspired me my entire life. So I'm really happy to give you this interview. You know, I met John when I was in college, senior year of college 20 years ago, and he changed my life. He was on a speaking tour. I heard him talk. I immediately was like, oh, I got to go visit that guy. He's living in El Salvador, where he started as a volunteer with the Jesuit Volunteer Corps. Then he was a combatant in the Civil War. Then he helped negotiate the peace accords in the Civil War. And then he helped rebuild this village and do all this incredible stuff afterwards, including being the coach of the national ice hockey team, which I think he may have started because ice hockey wasn't that big in El Salvador before this guy from the Bronx moved there. So, like I said, he's one of the greatest teachers and mentors I've ever known. Very, very excited to share this with you. So, and it's just the beginning. You know, at the last minute, I ask him how he helps communicate a sense of mission to the kids with whom he works. And the question is interrupted by my daughter because it had already been 2 hours of recording. So that's going to be for next time. And there's going to be many more next times with John. So if you listen to this and you have questions, there's anything you want to know about his life or what he's doing now or the foundation or just anything, let me know and I'll ask him. And I've got his number. We'll just do more. I want to do like 10 more shows with him this year if I can. He's just unbelievable. All right, let's jump in. Before we begin this episode, I want to put in a quick word from our sponsor. Me. We got the name for this podcast from the mission of Momentum Lab, our coaching program. We are both incubating the next generation of heroes and the next step in the evolution of consciousness. If you listen to the show, you're already a part of that process. Thank you. So if you haven't already, sign up for the newsletter to get insights, tools, and inspiration on living a purposeful, visionary, and impactful life. And if it ever dawns on you that that's easier to do with a community of excellence urging you on, that it can make the difference in you achieving your personal goals, check out Momentum Lab. Okay, back to the show. Where do we begin? It's a great question.
Well, you asked me about purpose.
Yeah.
I will share something about my background, which I don't like to do. But my grandfather, when I was really little, I used to get in the car with him, and we would drive to these neighborhoods, and it was way before homeless was a chic issue, or even considered a problem, And he knew all these guys, and he helped all these guys.
Homeless guys.
Holidays, every holiday began going to Mass, and we'll talk about that because the whole religion thing for me was also very interesting. But his life had purpose, and there were all kinds of characters. Like he just helped people. And then the religion thing was funny for me too. And culturally, I grew up in this Catholic environment, and with all the craziness, I saw all this good, And although I always felt, to this day, sort of on the outside of it all. I remember, I don't know, in the 30s, it must have been the original Christmas Carol, Dickens, and
The movie, though.
yeah, the original film, like one of the real old ones. It must have been the 30s or even 40s, and but always looking. There's a scene where Ebenezer's kind of looking in the window, and
Oh, I have that image in my head.
he's looking in the window, and his nephew is. They're having this. There are two of those scenes where his nephew is just. He's to be married, you know. And there's just great joy. And Ebenezer's on the outside, and then there's another scene where his worker, Tom, who he's very mean to, but he's standing on the outside, kind of looking in. So I always kind of felt that way, you know, and I still feel that way. You know, I went to live in Latin America a long, long time ago, over 40 years ago, and a great Argentinian songwriter, performer, Facundo Cabral, and there's a wonderful song that says, "Yo no soy de aquí, ni soy de allá." I'm not from here nor there. So I always felt that way.
So you felt that way about
My whole life.
here before you left.
Oh yeah, I never felt a part of anything. School, I never felt a part of school. Like I was never in any sort of group, you know. The stoners, what are the groups? The stoners, the jocks, all the different groups. I wasn't in any one of them. But I sort of dabbled everywhere. And then I think my real education begins inside of the Jesuits. And I knew Jesuits. I knew particularly this one guy, Daniel Berrigan, who was such a lovely guy, you know, and he did so many things. He was an activist, a very famous one. Got very famous. Cover of Time magazine, him and his brother, the underground.
They were anti-nuclear? Oh, Vietnam.
Vietnam. So his just stuff on him. His brother was a Josephite priest who would later leave and marry a woman named Elizabeth McAllister. She was a Catholic nun and he was a Catholic priest, and at that point Dan was like a famous writer, you know. He won the Lamont Poetry Award, and he was hanging out with the Kennedys up in, you know. And then his brother started going on the freedom rides into the South, and the Josephites were sort of I think they were founded. They're all about racial justice.
So it's a modern branch of Catholicism. It's not like the Jesuits. It's not like a centuries old thing.
No. The Jesuits are steeped in, as Dan would say, stinking of Jesuit is they're old. But so Phil started inviting his brother, and then Vietnam happens, and very important time, you know. And it's funny, I was born in '61, but I really feel like I'm part of that time, that age. Like I was meant to be in 1968. And I don't know, you know, not in an egotistical way, but just like it's just what I really feel. Even the music I listen to, you know. And
but even earlier today, you said that at 8 years old, you wanted to join Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers.
Yeah, so I had an opportunity, and I heard Cesar Chavez, and he was this, when he was little, you know. I loved his color. Like he had this beautiful brown, and of course it was, and all these very famous people were just were just flocking to hear him speak. And he was talking about what was going on in California, and I was ready to quit man the fourth grade. Like, what am I doing? You know, SAR reading modules. You know, this is dumb. Let me out of here. And of course they didn't take me. Just really disappointed.
So you asked?
I wrote a letter. I did that a number of times. At one point I wrote a letter also to the Scripps Institute of Oceanography in La Jolla, California, at UCSD. I must have been like 11. And I said, I'd like to come and study oceanography. Jacques Cousteau is also my... Underwater was... It's funny, I'm always looking for places like to be alone and quiet, you know?
Mm.
And I found that in the Jesuits. This podcast is so all over the place. But
I'm going to edit it into a seamless and beautiful whole.
I'm sure you will.
Yeah. It's going to be a work of art. It's going to be a crystal.
So anyway, back to and I wrote scripts and they also didn't accept me. But this woman from someone in admissions sent me all these books.
Whoa.
Like packets of stuff. So already kindness was like made a lot of sense to me, and I think that back to the Jesuits. So then I entered the Jesuits, and everything else was my school. My school life was just I had no interest, and there was always things that were more important. And I get to the Jesuits, and I found silence. This 30-day Ignatian retreat, 30 days of silence, and just made a lot of sense to me, right? Purpose. And someone told this story the other day. I heard this story about this old man and his grandson, and they go walking out somewhere, like where we are today. We're at this beautiful lake up in northern Washington. I guess that's where we are.
Yeah.
I love that we're close to Canada. I'm always like, oh, Canada. And anyway, they're walking, and the grandfather says to the grandson, he goes, listen, the kid's listening, and he says, the birds. He says, no, really listen. And the grandfather says, because there's some kind of a cart. Someone's pulling a wagon. And the kid goes, how do you know that? He says, and the wagon is empty. He says, well, how do you know it's empty? He goes, because it's making a lot of noise. And I realized, that when we're empty, we make a lot of noise. I made a lot of noise for a long time. And then the Jesuit retreat came where it was time to just really listen and be quiet. And it's funny, in Catholic prayer, you pray to win the lottery or the big game, and then Ignatius says, no, we don't ask for anything. And then he says, and all that we have, we give back. Wow, it's like, all that you have given me, all that I have received, I return to you.
That's the prayer.
That's the purpose of life. So, yeah, that's the prayer. All that I have, now I return it. It's all gift. And the other thing I learned from Daniel, it's funny, when he died, a lot of people talked about all his greatness. And what I remember most about him was his hospitality, And like when he hated when you were invited somewhere and people ordered in. Like that really bothered him. Like, because now they just order in, the Chinese restaurant or the whatever. And this was way, back in New York before. Now it's like crazy. It's all order in, right? But when Dan had someone over, he had his market for his sun-dried tomatoes, and then he had his fish guy to get his nice shrimp, and then he had his bread guy and this guy, and it was a whole process, And you'd walk up Broadway where he lived, and I love that. And I'm telling you all this because it really it sort of created the fundamentals of what I created in this foundation that I began in El Salvador, which is really what we're going to talk about eventually. But this is the part I want to talk about myself, not about the other stuff. But I think that the idea of like, you have given all to me, now I return it. Wow. And So I entered the Jesuits, and right away, again, I was definitely a misfit there as well. I was around all these really smart people, and they were priestly and holy, and I was just like, kind of a rascal.
Why did they even take you? Now knowing you, you've had such a huge influence on my life. Yeah. I'm just, how did that guy even get accepted to the...
Don't edit the laughter. Don't edit the laughter. Well, I'll tell you how that happened too. I didn't even really apply, and at one point I was riding my bike around the country, and
Before the Jesuits.
yeah, I was riding my bike. So I started doing these long bike rides, and never had any money. I would beg, and I received hospitality everywhere I went. Like, I could tell you thousands of stories of me showing up in some town, and I was a kid, and
This is college, high school, before?
just after high school, college. I was just, really tired of stuff, but I found a lot of freedom. I found a lot of freedom. So when I entered the Jesuits, this is after college now. When I entered the Jesuits, I started the process, and then I just took off on my bike because the weather was really good and it was time to go east. I started out in California. I started in San Diego, and I rode north, which was then they called it the Bike Centennial Route, up through Missoula, Montana. Those beautiful national parks there, and then eventually, I think I was in Chicago, and I got invited by this an African American church, and I started speaking. People would ask me to get up and talk. I gave this talk in this African American church.
What? You were giving talks back then?
Yeah, they asked me, like, they thought I was interesting. Like, why would a kid? First of all, everyone would say, like, who are your parents? Like you have no money, you're on this bike, you have 4 panniers, and a tent. Anyway, I digress about the Jesuits, and I called the Jesuit eventually, and I say, hey, this great guy, Tom McCormick, who loved taking risks, they had enough PhDs, I think, those kinds of guys. But Tom always liked kind of guys like me, like someone who was sort of like a little different. And I called Tom and I said, hey, am I accepted? Am I in? Like I was joining, like, I don't know. And he goes, yeah, you're acceptable, but what do you want to do? He says, could you be in California by July 31st? So I wrote to New York, and then I made it. I made it back, and I showed up on my bike, and I entered the Jesuits. But my point is, they sent me to Mexico. And there again, they sent me to work in this place called Casa de los Pobres. And I always say, I burned every degree I ever had because I had no interest in them. I burned paper. And I went to Casa de los Pobres, and I really thought it was where my education began. So if I'm ever asked, where'd you go to school, I always say, Casa de los Pobres, the House of the Poor in Tijuana. And there were 2 amazing nuns, and they're still alive, Armida Andrade and Maria Eugenia Espinosa. And they ran this amazing house, doing all kinds of things. Of course, feeding people, And they've kind of figured me out, like right away. They said, yeah, you probably don't want to work on a food line. But I was very attracted to the prison. There was this jail there called La Ocho. Again, I'm going back to purpose, okay?
Yeah. You can't escape it.
No. I'm the hound of heaven, right? Like, leave me alone. I just want to, live my life. Let me be like a hippie. And Nah, there was none of that. But anyway, so I was in this prison. I worked in this jail. And I felt, again, because I feel so marginalized myself, always. And it was a cell block, and the prison was called La Ocho. It was on 8th Avenue, La Ocho. Like infamous, dirty, filthy, disgusting shit. You walk in, the urine, the smell of La Ocho. Right? It would later become my home, La Ocho. And so I was very drawn to the mentally ill there. And what they would do there was there was a whole, maybe the 3rd floor. I don't really remember. So I was really drawn to those people. And I had no español, right? You know, I'm you know.
You're gringo. You're shanky gringo.
New Yorker. I can curse, you know. Go fuck yourself. Hey, get the hell out. I do that really well. Very fluent in New York. So I'm there, and we took the Spanish classes. I wasn't really interested, you know. I wanted to be on the street always. And my first assignment before Mexico was in L.A. And all the Jesuit novices, you know, you're supposed to do, they called it the poverty experiment, which is the poverty experiment, you can imagine.
Oh, yeah, you'd already done that.
It's like, you're fucking kidding me. The poverty experiment, we live in these amazing houses, you know, on Vermont and Adams. Like these historic houses, this is the poverty experience because the people around us spoke Spanish. And then, of course, USC is 2 blocks away. You know what I mean? And I used to go over there all the time. You know, I think it's called the Rose Garden, right by the LA Coliseum. That's exactly where we were. Anyway, I spent that my first job. I would wear, ride my bike, kind of pretentious, beret, Roman collar. But
that's what the priests wear?
Yeah, you know, the black with and fatigues that were just ripped and torn up. And I'd pedal downtown, and I'd sit. I sat on the sidewalk because I was rejected by the Catholic worker. It was funny, the experience that I called the LA Catholic worker, and this guy said to me, again, you know, how often, like those of us on the left, the things we most despise, the behavior that we despise, and if you allow me to say, the opposition or the right, we do it all the time. And I called the guy and I said, hey man, I'm a Jesuit novice, I'm here in LA, you know, I'm a New York guy, I'd love to come and help out. And he's a famous guy, I won't mention his name on the podcast. And he says, you know, you Jesuits, he goes, we're doers, you're just thinkers. So I'm like, fuck this guy. You know, I'm gonna do my own thing. And the guy I was assigned to at the old LA cathedral, Santa Vibiana. I know I jump around, but that's the brain, you know, the drugs, the age, there's a lot of deficits in this head of mine. But his name was John Steinbach. And
the famous author.
Well, no, he just shared the name. And this guy was amazing, though. You know, and he said, I said, hey, I just want to be on the street, like he did. And they later made him a bishop. It's like he asked me how I got in the Jesuits. How did they make that guy a bishop? You know, and he said to me, he says, you're not gonna do anything great here. He goes, just be here. Wow, right? And I had other people invite me to the same sort of invitation, and I did. I sat on the sidewalk, and of course, the collar attracts people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the craziest people, and of course, I loved it. Prostitutes and drug addicts, and then eventually I. Down around the Catholic worker, around the street was like 6th and Gladys, which is like the Skid Row area,
okay,
where the famous Episcopalian priest, Father Alice, Sister Alice, I think that was her name. There were immigrant families living in these flop houses, and So I don't know how I wound up like running these groups. And this is like part of my life too. Like I would eventually, the immigrants were really afraid. They were really afraid for a lot of reasons. This is way back, right? But still, it was the same kind of situation. And rough. I mean, like...
It's like early 80s.
Yeah, people, shooting heroin, like, in the hallways. And you're not on Park Avenue anymore, okay? But I eventually got to know them, and I didn't know any Espanol, So I started these groups. And I would write out, like, a greeting. And it kind of sounded like this. Buenos dias. Me alegro. That kind of thing. And they were all so kind. And then they would just go. And then, of course, I would just sort of nod my head and acknowledge, kind of facilitate. And I ran these groups. And that was it was an amazing experience. And I would later meet up with a lot of those women that I had met when I could speak Espanol. And of course I made the confession. I said, back in the day I didn't really understand anything. It's a pleasure to really talk to you now. So I did that, and then they sent me to Mexico, to get back to that story. So in the jail, again, very Ignatian-like. And I remember, and I decided that that's where I wanted to be. And at one point, there was a guy, Gabriel, and it's really funny. Like the narco people would be like on the first floor. The second floor would be like where they'd rest, like the stupid kids from San Diego State or USD that get arrested for drinking and mouthing off to a policia. And then of course the third floor, right, where the mentally ill were, and they were being abused. They were being given drugs. They were being raped. Like what do they call it? Chicken fights. Like they give, I don't know, PCP or whatever those drugs that would make people super aggressive. They would get these guys high on this stuff or off on this stuff, and then they'd put them in the middle of the jail and they'd almost beat each other to death. So I decided that I wanted to be what an idea. I would be the monitor, like a human rights monitor in the jail. But of course I didn't have permission to be there all the time. So I had this idea. I met this woman in Chula Vista, which is a suburb. I could say her first name, Consuelo. She was a Mexicana, a real estate woman, and very wonderful, lovely woman. Eventually her psychiatrist almost forbade her to even talk to me because I would set her back. I'd go and tell her these stories, and she would be so emotionally wrecked. But I said to her, hey, I have this idea. I had the idea that if the warden would let me become the jail painter, I had this idea, like, I'll paint the jail. And then by becoming the jail painter, I'd have access to the whole jail. So I went and I said to her, hi, I'm a Jesuit novice, and we'd like to make, kind of like that lenient. We said, we'd like to make the jail a better place. We're going to bring blankets to the prisoners. We're going to cement the beds, and we're going to paint the whole place, free of charge. And Consuelo gave me all the money. So of course the warden accepted it. Then I had my inn. I had access to the prison 24 hours a day as the jail painter. Honestly, the trans sex workers were the best painters. And they were great. I'd get to pull people out of the prisons, out of their cells, but I got to monitor what was going on the third floor. And then at one point, it was time for me to go off and study philosophy because, the Jesuits have that part. And I remember very Ignatian-like, childlike, but but it is through the wisdom of children that we can only grow. And I went and I sat before the imagen, the image of the Virgen de Guadalupe. And Mexicans have this incredible devotion to her. And I said to her, like Ignatius, he was a soldier. You know, and they blew his leg off, and he was so vain. They say in those days in País Vasco that, you know, they wore certain boots or hose, and then he was so vain. He says, "Don't take my leg." And of course, he goes into, they don't cut his leg off, but they take him away, and he, you know, incredible pain. He has all these hallucinations and visions, and eventually he becomes the Jesuits. So anyway, and then at one point he laid down his arms. He was a soldier, and he laid his arms down before an image of Our Lady, and he says, "I will be in service to you forever," and or something like that. And I did that. I said to her, "If you want me to stay in this prison, I will stay here the rest of my life. I will stay here the rest of my life." And then at that point, I had met, there was another part of the jail on the 4th floor that I had no access to. And that's where they brought Central Americans. That at that point, the Central American wars were roaring. Guatemala, Nicaragua, El Salvador. And of course, you know, I'm at the very Tarzan level. But, you know, they say, there's a beautiful reading that says, you know, if you have the desire to understand, you'll be given that gift of understanding, right? And I met these two brothers. They were from a place called San Miguel in El Salvador. And at that point, I had no idea where San Miguel was. I knew El Salvador. I knew where it was. I had some sort of idea. In the Jesuits, I had learned about Oscar Romero. And I learned about the great teacher, this guy Rutilio Grande. They were both murdered, right?
And this was after they were both murdered?
Yeah, so I was this great Jesuit, well, the three great Jesuits that I knew at that time that were working in LA. A guy named Greg Boyle, who of course he's Homeboy Industries. Another is Michael Kennedy, who started the Casa Rutilio Grande, and he works in the prisons in California now. Remarkable. And then the third was a guy named Dick Howard. And they were all just very lovely people, and I felt an affinity to them. And so anyway, at the same time as I meet these brothers, and they're telling me these stories about war in El Salvador, and I knew something about it, you know, and it's so funny, like the whole Christian tradition, you know, it can be so fucked up in so many ways. But one very famous Jesuit theologian says, "Don't worry about any of it." He says, "Matthew 25, that's what you need to know." I said, "What's Matthew 25? I didn't do my scripture homework." And it says, "When I was hungry, you gave me to eat." And it goes on, and when I was a prisoner, you came to be with me. And when I was a stranger in a foreign land, you opened your door. Wow. And that's it. And he said to me, and a famous theologian, and he says, "That's all you need to worry about. Don't worry about the rest." And so around that time, and I'm buzzing on that. And then I met this guy, Pozole, was his apodo, his nickname. And wow, what a guy he was. But he was a coyote, you know, and he loved the nuns. Si madre, you know. They just, but Pozole's like an underground guy. And I asked him if I could run across the border with him one night, you know. Claro, he's still in jail. I said, when you get out, you know,
Oh yeah, you met him in jail.
Yeah, of
course.
He's behind.
You meet everybody in jail.
He's behind bars, you know. So Pozole says to me, he says, "Claro," he says, "Sure." And then Pasola used to come out and help me paint. You know, my friend, because I can get guys out, except the Central Americans, who are being tortured. They used to have this thing called the Coke bottle torture, where they would they would tap the ears and the mouth, and they would take a Coke bottle, and they would shake it, and they would shoot the carbonation through the head, and it would just zap people like nuts, like crazy shit they would do. They had the capucha, where they put people's heads in bags. They were torturing people, and it was all extortion, and it was a big business. So at that point in the 80s...
So what are they going to get from these Central American refugees?
Well, they have family. And that people would pay to get their kids out. So, for example, it was a big business. And I think this guy, Joseph Wamba, wrote a really interesting book called The Border. I never wrote a book, nor will I. But Wamba kind of recorded what was going on, and we were living it. So, for example, if a family would come, they would be arrested. The Mexican authorities would, of course, and then, you know, it's an immigrant story like all of us, right? You know, your family, my family. You come because you have someone here, right? And that's what the Italians did, the people from Asia did. Of course, Africa's a different story, right? But Salvadorans always have someone. So if these two guys had a brother in L.A., and the Mexicans would say, okay, $3,000 a piece, $3,000 a piece. And we even knew, and I knew this from my experience, my later experience, that even U.S. immigration people, the Mexicans would sell quite often immigrants to U.S. immigration. This is early 80s. And then they would sell the people over to their family members. So it was crazy. And Matthew 25 says, strangers to foreign land, open the door. Father Kennedy and Greg and Dick opened up a house called La Casa Rutilio Grande on Sunset Boulevard. Like Hollywood, man, right there, you know. Like, wow. It was just crazy. Anyway, the long story is I called my Jesuit superior, and you know, the Jesuits are kind of known for that 5 o'clock happy hour, right? The preprandial, as they called it. And I made sure I knew that my superior would, at around 6:15, he was probably 2 or 3 cocktails in. I called him on the phone, and I said, hey, tomorrow night I'm going to cross the border. Do I have your permission? Sure, have my permission. And then I ran across the border with Pozole. And it was unbelievable. It was like, it truly was like a psychedelic experience. It was terrifying and thrilling at the same time. And it's funny that, you know, when you leave Tijuana, you know, you basically, all you see is the lights of San Diego, and of course the San Diego is just, Dan Berrigan, I think, once said that there's so much military hardware there, it's amazing that it just doesn't fall in, you know. But you see the lights of all the ships, and just the juxtaposition of life, and you know, from really abject poverty in those days to, you know, the United States. And we began to, I got into the business of bringing people across the border. And we had an underground house, and the nuns in Tijuana were amazing about that. And I will tell one story for podcast value, because people should be entertained too, right? How difficult it was, you know, to bring people across the border then and now. People say, oh, then. No, then it was also difficult. But we would cross people in many, many different ways, and we finally got them across. And used to be in California, there was I just drove through it the other day. I was in Southern California. There was like a roadblock and around San Clemente, this beautiful, beautiful coastline where Nixon had his house. And miles and miles of just incredible surf and beach. But there's this roadblock, and if you're a brown person in those days, they stop you. Citizenship, like a citizenship check.
I've seen those.
Yeah.
Recently. Yeah.
And very difficult to get through there. The other way to go was because you had to leave the border, San Diego, the Imperial Valley. Very difficult to go north. Riverside also had its version, and of course, but you had to get through. So, and we got pretty good at it. At one point, we were flying. There was an airline in those days called PSA, a big smile on the airplane, and we were, myself and fellow co-conspirators, we used to fly people out of San Diego. In those days, it was very different. And we'd get them to LA, and then we'd make sure we'd get people to where they needed to go. And then we became part of the sanctuary movement. And that's a whole nother story. There should be a whole podcast about that. But it really was a brilliant period in time where mosques, churches, temples, people of faith, non-believers, we really began to embrace this idea that, not only does faith demand us to do that, not only does our own humanity require us to do that, but it's also really, the fundamentals of the United States, right? I don't know, what does it say on the Statue of Liberty? So anyway, a bunch of brothers show up from Guatemala, and they were arrested at the border. And then we have this great contact. There was an amazing priest, this guy, Father Chayin, and all these heroes that that no one will ever know about. They got arrested, and then the authorities sent them to Father Chayin, and they were mums from Guatemala. And they were very dark and very short, like really short. And they spoke Mum, they didn't speak Spanish. And we thought, wow, this is going to be challenging at the San Diego airport, Lindbergh Field. There's just no fucking way we're crossing with these guys, So, like everything, I pray. And then I go to a party in San Diego because I had this other life too. I'm in a party in San Diego, and I meet this guy that runs a limousine company. And he says, and a friend is telling what and he says, wow, I goes, of course to him it's just a giant adventure, right? He says, I drive through San Clemente all the time. And he says, I'll bring him. You get him to San Diego, and we'll go. And I don't think I'm incriminating anyone here, but the Jesuits let us use there. In those days, they had this parish on 32nd and Imperial, which is like the barrio of San Diego. San Diego also has its side. And so, of course, a limousine pulling up in front of a church is, some narco guy or whatever. We got the mums across the border, and they were very, very religious. And like every time they saw an image, some religious image, they would literally go on their knees to the point where you had to go, all right, yeah, we just prayed, St. Francis, I got 10 more religious images ahead of me, can we just make it a one-stop shop here? So finally the day comes, Posoli, we get him across the border, and we get him to San Diego, and then it's our big day to go to LA to Mike Kennedy's place up in Los Angeles. And of course, I'm drinking in the back of the limousine. I said, you got the limo, you got to take advantage. And they're praying. The mums are praying, and just a lovely chant. I remember that. Like, wow, where do these people come from, the land of Oz, right? The poppy field, somewhere. They were extraordinary. And sure enough, we got them through. That lasted almost 2.5 years, that work. And then I eventually got arrested, and I got kicked out of the country, eventually. And then I was asked to go to El Salvador. I knew two great Jesuits, Father Ignacio Yek and this other guy, Father Michael Campbell Johnson. It was interesting, in the 80s in El Salvador, it was Vietnam II, where a complete, it was a civil war, but it was also a U.S. intervention where the United States was backing a very cruel and unjust Salvadoran government. And at one point, the great ambassador Robert White, after they murdered U.S. Maryknoll's sisters and Ursuline's sister, and a lay missionary, Jean Donovan, he said to President Carter, he goes, "We're just supporting a pathological killer." And of course, Oscar Romero himself, the martyred archbishop, at one point early on wrote President Carter. He said, he basically said, what you're doing here, you're just intensifying. I'm paraphrasing completely, intensifying the means of death, and you're going to prolong. And of course, Carter fell on deaf ears, and the Salvadoran War, which really begins at the murder of Romero around 1980, would go all the way to 1992 at the murder of the same Jesuits that invited me to come. And I became part of this team, and again, it was an invitation from an archbishop that said, basically, go and be church, and we accompanied civilians in the mountainous region called Chalatenango, and I got to spend the war years there, and it was amazing that if the United States policy, along with the Salvadoran government, was to depopulate, like they did in Vietnam. I think it was Westmoreland that said, you dry up the sea and the fish will die. So through the use of bombing tactics, through these very slow-moving B-1s, 500-pound bombs, which are these big 500-pound bombs, which are nothing now. They're like fireworks, and the stuff that they've dropped on Afghanistan. They continue, these drones drop extraordinarily large weapons systems, big bombs. But these 500-pound bombs were just horrible, and then of course napalm. They destroyed not only the people, but also the countryside, and the people were pushed and pushed and pushed, and people were living in those mountains. They ran from their homes, and maybe I could drop back because it is a podcast and it's about telling stories, but sometimes the church in history that gets it right, and they got it right in El Salvador. And starting with Father Grande, this idea of we have to leave these institutions and these big churches and, that sort of boat going by. But go and be in the communities. Go and be with the people. And so Father Grande was really the model for all of us. And he went back home where he was from. He went to live in this area called Aguilares, in the area Paisnal, actually, where he's from. And people tell great stories about him, but he, more than anything else, he listened. And I had a woman once tell me that Father Grande was the first person that ever asked her a question. Her whole life was, orders and demands. I think probably mirroring many cultures around the world, right? Where women, a great community leader, she once said to me, she says, en español dice, la mujer en El Salvador vale un poquito más de una gallina, pero mucho menos de una vaca lechera. the women in El Salvador are valued a little more than a hen, but much less than a cow that produces milk. Boy. And there was Grande, right? So, and then Grande's deal was, you bring something to the table. You bring something to the table. And he brought literacy, words, and this incredible transformation, you know, all of a sudden where, you know, scripture, which was sort of taught on high, now we say it was kind of like the Wizard of Oz, right? And then Grande pulls the curtain away, like Toto did, and the little wizard ran out. But Grande cracks that book, and all of a sudden, people begin to understand the very powerful gospel passages, but not from some other place, but looking at it from their perspective, from the ground up, the perspective of the victim. And that would be the basis of what would be known as liberation theology, that God is a liberating God, and that all those lessons that they were taught forever. You're poor because it's God's will. Your children died of diarrhea because it's God's will. But don't worry. Because heaven will belong to you. And Grande basically said, well, yeah, bullshit. No, that's not how it is. That, and then we begin to see not Grande organizing people. And I think, and I talk to a lot of people about this, you know, a lot of times we like to think that, you know, these figures that we, you know, and very important figures. Ramirez is obviously a very important figure. You know, they make them saints in the Catholic Church. Grande's a saint now. But what he did was, it was like he set something off, you know, by opening up the Word, and then people began to organize. People realized that, yeah, this isn't God's will. You know, it's not God's will that we work. In the early days, the people would work for food, like Steinbeck. You know, Steinbeck. I always think of In Dubious Battle. You know, Steinbeck was such an important, and I've met Jesuits that knew him. But how important, but the same thing was happening like a place like El Salvador, and people started negotiating for an extra tortilla, and because they go and pick coffee and they bring their children, and children's hands were better, that they wouldn't damage. Coffee's like an arbusto, like a bush, right? But anyway, they bring their kids, so they'd say to the, you know, like a dubious battle, you know, they work for the company store. They had to pay for the bag.
Yeah.
They had to buy the food. And people from like our area, Chalatenango, would go far to the coffee producing regions of the country. So, you know, and very cold, and the time of year that they pick, you know, the illness, but and they would just demand another tortilla. And of course, the response was no. And that sets off the war against the church, the martyrs. And in 1977, they murder Grande. And thinking Grande really is the troublemaker. You know, he brought the seed. And then, of course, they tell stories of Oscar Romero, and this is important to talk about on the podcast. These are people that... And Romero was made an archbishop because he was probably a really good guy. You know, and I'm not a Romero scholar, but I know this, that he loved Rutilio Grande. And again, you know, ultimately all we really strive for, and all of us, is community and love. Community and love. And I think Romero found love with his brother Rutilio, you know. And the story is that when Grande is killed, Romero has this conversion. But there's another story that is written. They say that, again, I'll tell it my way. Romero was invited to a church. I think I told you this story once, but it's a beautiful story. Romero was invited to this church, and of course, after these services, you know, the people come up and they greet, like speakers. Stanford University has speakers. At the end, people come up and want to shake the speaker's hand. You know, Kurt Vonnegut. Oh, Kurt, you were great. You know, and
that's how I met you.
Yeah, I'm not Kurt Vonnegut. Hey.
But I wanted to shake your hand.
There you go. I wanted to shake your hand. You want to know the truth. You were like this light. Who is this guy? Who is this guy? But anyway, the story goes that at least the way I remember it, and the way I tell it, is sort of the last guy that comes through comes in with his bare feet, and he has a satchel over his shoulder, and he has like campesinos do, they have a corbo, which some people call it a machete, but the corbo, it's a very long, so it almost looks like a sword, right? The tools of work. And he has working man's hands, you know, working man's hands. And of course, Romero's fearful, because we're always afraid of the things we don't know, right? Like, that neighborhood's a bad neighborhood. They used to say Yankee Stadium was a bad neighborhood. It was a bad neighborhood because people spoke Spanish there, or because we don't know. The things we don't know we're afraid of. So Romero was kind of probably fearful. First of all, he's not like, you know, it's funny, in El Salvador, you know, the richer they are, the less physical they are. You know, they kiss at a distance, mwah, mwah. If you could see me, you know, you know, it's always very, you don't touch, it's always sort of very, you know, kind of like gringos, you know, very. And, but anyway, this guy comes up, and he pulls a tomato out of his satchel, and he also reaches into his pocket. And Salvadorans love salt. And, you know, not the salt shaker. He just takes his hands and he pulls this shh. And he's sitting there with this other priest, you know, and they're watching this whole scene, and you know, Romero's not really quite sure what the hell is going on, I don't think. I imagine all this, right? And he cuts it. And, you know, it's so funny, like, in Latin America and certainly other parts of the world, I've seen you with a knife. Your mother taught you well. But we're clumsy with that. But boy, even little kids in El Salvador can cut a mango up, peel a mango beautifully. I imagine India the same way, right? Just beautifully peeling, you know. And he cuts this tomato in half with this big corbo, this sword, if you will, machete, salt on it, and half of it, and he hands Romero the tomato, half a tomato. And the priest that tells the story, again, I think I'm telling you correctly. If not, it's a great story anyway. He drives back. Romero always drove himself, and he's got this priest with him. And he's really quiet. And then finally he turns to the priest and says, I think the guy was trying to tell me with the half a tomato. And the guy says, Oscar, he goes, that's probably what he had to eat today, and he gave you half. And then he says that Romero broke down in tears. And this guy says Romero was converted by a half a tomato. But when they killed Rutilio Grande in 77, you know, the first priest of this period to be murdered, cold blood, they gunned him down. And he was traveling with an elderly guy and a kid, Rutilio Lemos They all got ordained. And Salorzano, Nelson Salorzano, I think the name's, gunned them down. There used to be like a vehicle called the Thing. It was kind of like, not really a Jeep, but it had that 1.6 liter motor, and you take the doors off, and he was going to celebrate Mass in another village. Maybe it's on the dirt road. Then it was probably a 10 or 15 minute drive between Aguilares and Paisnal, and they waited for him in the sugarcane fields. When he went by, they gunned him down, and the bullets went through his back, and they killed all three. So, of course, the Jesuits are ready to start the fight. And the story has it that they can't find Romero. They can't find Romero. And someone told me this story. They were in the seminary where Romero had his residence at the time. And they were looking for, he's a coward. Typical. We knew he was going to be this way. We knew he was going to be this way. He's a coward. He's weak. He doesn't have a voice. And this one priest told me this story. He said he was sent out to find Romero. He was the young guy, the cabana boy of the seminary. Go find this guy. And he says he walked by the chapel, and there's Romero. He doesn't know it's Romero. He just sees this older man, sort of slumped, sitting before the sacrament in silence. And then he goes to sort of pounce on this guy. Says, "Come on, help me." And then Romero kind of turns around, and I think he said to him, "Tell the others when I'm ready, I'll come out." And when he came out, he became the voice of the voiceless. My tradition would say he was filled with the Holy Spirit, and right away he became the leader that he never was. Not that it was ever his aspiration or his tendency was to be very meek, but at that moment he was the leader that the campesino people, the marginalized, the people that are being literally obliterated. He became their guy, and he never turned back. And he was fearless publicly, but we know he was always afraid. And a great leader during the war told me once, she said, it's not about not being afraid. It's about not allowing fear to stop you from doing what's right. Right? And Romero knew he'd be killed. He knew he'd be killed. He knew. And then after Grande, of course, they began murdering not only thousands and thousands of campesino people in El Salvador, but also, religious, women, men, priests, nuns, ministers, whoever, community leaders, teachers, anyone. And of course, as history shows us, when people are oppressed, sometimes they back off, most times they don't. They get stronger. They're filled with the Spirit of God. And that's what happened. And then they thought by murdering Oscar Romero, and he was killed while celebrating a Mass. And the day before the Mass, he gave this very famous talk. And it was amazing. We're using this media now. But Romero was using the media. He was using radio, and the government was blowing up the radio station. They blew up the Catholic radio station, and then people started, because people would listen to Romero on the radio, like these homilies, these masses, and people would gather in their villages. There was these radios that everyone had, to the point where the government would arrest you for carrying batteries, because they knew the batteries were going into these radios, and they would gather. Groups would gather in the villages all over the country, and later around the world to hear what Romero had to say. And the word we use in El Salvador is coyuntura. And he began to he would talk about the readings, and he'd talk about, what was going on in the church, and then he'd get to the part of the coyuntura, the analysis. And he began to denounce by name the powers and principalities, by name. Fearless, but of course being terrified inside. And each week, and then they'd blow up the radio station, and then there are great stories about how people would fly in with mobile transmitters, so his voice would not be silenced. And then the day before he was murdered, he spoke knowing that not only the communities were listening to him, but also the powers and principalities. And he told the Salvadoran army, the soldiers, the same poor that were killing the same poor in the Civil War, and he said, I'll paraphrase again, that there's a higher law, there's a command that supersedes all, thou shalt not kill. And he said to the soldiers, if you are ordered to kill, he wasn't woke, he only said brother, but he meant brother and sister. A brother or sister Salvadoran, disobey that order. What did he say? I demand, I plead, I order you, cease the repression. And of course everyone knew that was it. He had ordered the Salvadoran soldier to disobey their commander's orders to kill. And in those days, it was just, thousands and thousands of people were being killed by not only army but death squads. And I would recommend to all of your listeners, Joan Didion, of course, we all love for so many reasons. But she wrote a very small book called El Salvador. And I read an interview that she gave. It was that she was only there about 7 days, a week. But I think she said in the interview that she wrote as if they were Polaroid photographs. But she remembers going out to this place called El Playón at the foot of the volcano in San Salvador, where the mothers would go and try to find the bodies of their dead children, their disappeared children. And that was the environment in which Romero was a bishop. And then when he was killed in 1980, Salvadoran War begins, pretty much. And full out, a war against the poor. And it would last until 1992, a 12-year civil war. And it only ended because in 1989, the Salvadoran army marched into the Jesuit University and gunned down 6 Jesuit professors, famous Jesuit professors. A woman that was a collaborator who worked for the Jesuits, and her daughter, Selena and Elba Ramos. And it's interesting, when they killed already thousands of people, and and they killed the Archbishop, they killed all kinds of people. But it wasn't until '89, when the murder of the Jesuits, when I think that network of academics, alumni all over the world, all of a sudden people are saying, what the hell is going on in El Salvador? And the United States, wars can only be fought if they're supported, right? I mean, it costs money to fight a war. And it took a while, but there was a negotiation, and all of a sudden, without that money, the Salvadoran War was a business, like all wars are. In those days, they say it was $1 million+ a day, which now is, a pizza money, right? But in those days, it was a significant amount of money. And I remember learning that it was probably the second largest foreign aid package outside of what was going to Israel. I may be wrong on that, but I was told that at the time. But it seemed like a significant amount of money. And of course, most of that money wasn't, yeah, they were killing people, but people were making a lot of money off of that war. The murder of the Jesuits was significant. Incredibly significant, because they stopped the aid. And there was a Massachusetts congressman named Joe Moakley. And they put him in charge of this sort of committee. Again, he was sort of a funny guy. Like, he was, the big joke was, he says, I think the quote is something like, goes, geez, foreign policy, they put me in charge. He's from Cambridge, Mass. The other side, he would always say, the other side of Cambridge. There is another side, it's not just Harvard. He would say, foreign policy, because geez, I have a hard time ordering food at the Chinese restaurant. And he was that kind of guy. He was an old school guy. And he also said something about, we talk about purpose. And I think I remember this correctly too. He said something like, he was the kind of guy that really believed that that being a congressman was truly about service. Wow. And a deeper meaning. I think now it's about re-election. And then I love the way he said El Salvador. El Salvador. It's beautiful. The Cambridge twang. And he led a committee that saw what was going on. And it took great courage to do that. El Salvador was a very, very important piece of U.S. foreign policy at the time. And of course, now it's forgotten. And, the Reagan, I was just in California. And President Reagan, remember that he used to, there was one famous talk where he drew the line. He literally drew a line across the board, and he was very concerned about Nicaragua, as President Reagan used to call it. And of course, El Salvador, and this idea that we're always creating enemies, right? We're always doing that. And once we do that, we're doing it in El Salvador right now. We're looking at a bad situation and with gangs, and we'll get into that at some point, at some edition of our podcast. But we're always creating enemies. So, and Reagan sort of painted a picture where the communists, and this isn't far-fetched, I think you could find this talk very easily, but the communists were going to crawl over the Mexican border, and they needed to be stopped. And really the language is something like, the tomb of the Reds would end in El Salvador. The tomb of the Reds. And but for a U.S. congressman to see beyond, rhetoric that has become part of the culture, right? Anti-communism. It's always anti-something, right? Took great courage, and I think it was the same courage of like a Romero or a Grande, or even us, or what sometimes we're invited to do or become, and sometimes we allow fear, like my friend Maria Chichilco said, about the thing about you never stop being afraid, but you don't let fear stop you from doing what's right, but we often do that. And Moakley and of course others began to tell the story of El Salvador, and that funding ended. And the environment post-war for many of us was very difficult. Some of us were witness to things. Others were, had friends and family that had been savagely murdered. Communities completely destroyed. And it's interesting, and so many of those people now were, 30, 40 years on this side of it. And but people will remember how the worst, but also the best part of their lives, the organization, you know. And in Salvador, they don't really say it here. When you say in El Salvador, es una comunidad bien organizado, like they're organized. We're not just talking about, you know, the dishes in the pantry in order. I mean, organized is a very powerful term of communities not only unified, but also communities that, and again, my tradition reminds me of the Acts of the Apostles, you know, which would mean, how about this, everyone according to their need, and we live in common and in kind, and we live that way. And for myself, you know, just a New York guy, I feel so fortunate that I had the opportunity to be part of that organization. So when the war ended, you know, like all post-war countries, a lot of interest, aid, and of course NGOs, hundreds of them, you know, some good, some bad. But for me, it became pretty clear that people were really hurting. And I also had enough knowledge of the world to know that all of this aid, all of this help, all of these good people would soon be gone, right? Because, you know, unfortunately, it's become more this way. Like we have very little interest, you know. We go to the hot spots, you know. One day it's El Salvador, the next day it's Chiapas, the next day it's South Africa, the next day it's Haiti, the next, wherever, the Ukraine. I think we're already tiring of the Ukraine, right? On to the next thing, bigger and better. And I saw things in myself and in ex-combatants that were so broken. And how do you heal brokenness? You know, purpose, love, and community. But it would take time. And so many of the ex-combatants and a lot of young boys that were sort of thrown into this thing at the end. It was interesting that the original combatants, the people where I live, rural campesinos, they just wanted to go back to work, you know. They wanted the joy of plowing the soil, you know, of in El Salvador. If it was a video podcast, these big sticks they called chuzos, and they carry their seeds in a satchel, and to be able to seed the rows with corn, and then as July rolls in, around August, beans and vegetables. And it was there, and they had an affinity to the land. And at the end of the Salvadoran War, certainly by the offensive, and we didn't spend a lot of time there, but maybe we can come back sometime and talk about that, because that was a horrible experience when the Jesuits were murdered in '89. I should share that, but the joy of these men, you know, that fought all those years, and now all they wanted to do was go back to the land. But at the end, during the offensive, they needed more bodies. Again, you know, as Phil Berrigan, one of the great nonviolent resistors of our time, would say, you just can't do a little violence. And at the end, the same FMLN, you know, defending, they were of the people, but at the end they became just like the others. And so many boys and girls died in 1989 during that same offensive that murdered the Jesuits. That was November 16th, 1989. And But all these kids had no affinity. They didn't grow up on the land like their mothers and fathers. They came from refugee camps to the conflict zone. So when the war ended, you could only imagine the UN had established these reinsertion camps, they were called. And in these camps, they had to stay there a certain period of time. And of course, we had lived 12 years with incredible discipline because the war required that. Incredible unity because the war required that. But now, in those reinsertion camps, in some cases, many of the elders weren't going to spend 6 months in a reinsertion camp, with UN Blue Berets monitoring their every move. They went to work the land, and these camps became sort of like a lot of boys were there, playing cards, drinking, smoking, gambling. For myself, I wasn't sure what I was going to do. I came back to New York somewhat broken, and I also had a horrible case of hepatitis. And sometimes being ill, I'm going for a little something now as well. It slows you down, and you begin to think. And I spent time with Father Daniel Berrigan, who, with my grandfather, is the great mentor of my life. So many, but I could say that he just taught me so many things. And I decided I was going to ride my bicycle back from New York to El Salvador, but through Vancouver, Canada. I sort of tacked the United States, and Dan, who knew activists all over the country. And there was also a conversation with the actor Martin Sheen, who's been a marvelous friend to peace and justice, and loved Dan very much. And we created this thing called the Time to Heal Tour. And I remember having the conversation at Dan's place on 98th Street off Central Park. And I remember thinking that I know I needed to cry a lot. And I had this idea that, again, Matthew 25, and then part of Matthew 25 also talks about we bury our dead. And I remember this story when I was in New York there was this village that they had captured some boy, and he was a guerrilla fighter. And what they did was they lined up all the women in the town on this basketball court. During the Alliance for Progress, during the Kennedy period, they built basketball courts all over Latin America, like basketball diplomacy. I guess they never read that in those days basketball wasn't even played. They all became they call it futbolito, right? Soccer courts. But they lined these women up, and they dragged this kid, and I was sitting inside of this church, kind of hiding and kind of watching. And they obviously had tortured this kid, and they were trying to get information from him. And then at some point, this colonel, can't remember the name, he's dead now. I think it was this guy named Cáceres, I'm not really sure. But he kept screaming, who does this boy belong to? Who's his mother? What a disgrace to have this terrorist. And that's what these resistance fighters were called, terrorists. They use the same language now about gang members. And the women looked stoically, all of them carried sort of this empty, glossy sort of look, and they looked forward, and no one dared to react. And then this other guy came and kept kicking this near dead kid, And then the colonel had grabbed this kid by the neck, and he pulled out a sidearm, and he shot him in the head and left the body on the ground. And the women stoically, no one reacted. And the mother was right there. And then I thought about that day, and I eventually at one point went to her and I said, "Are you okay? You could cry." And she says, "We have no time to cry right now." She says, "Someday we will cry, but not now, because tomorrow they're going to kill someone else's boy. We have too much to do right now." And when I thought about what we needed to do, hence this Time to Heal tour, I thought, okay, the first thing we need to do is cry. Not only do we have to cry in El Salvador, but if the violence originated here, if we were not only the intellectual authors of it, but the financiers of it, that we also need to cry. So the tour was 122 cities in the United States and Canada, and Mexico, Guatemala, and El Salvador. And I went on the road, and we cried every night. I did. And I thought of this friend who I knew, and her daughter was murdered during the war. Ceci was her name. And I loved her mother. And I said, "Hey, let's go find Ceci." And so many of our dead were buried in shallow graves along the hillside. And it was really crazy that a lot of old men knew where these bodies were. And then eventually Maria called my name one morning and said, "Let's go get Ceci." And I remember in a way feeling very weird sense of joy that we were going to go do that. And that we gathered pick, shovel, and black bags. And this old man brought us like a GPS along this hillside, exactly where it was. And I tell the story because it's significant. And inside of that grave, that shallow grave, there were 6 other bodies. Wow. And there was a skeleton there with a blue and white checkered shirt. And Ceci's sister had lent her that shirt the day she was killed. And of course her mother recognized her teeth. And we put all those restos into that black bag. And that was really the beginning of the Tamarindo Foundation, that we were going to help people from the ground up. We're going to begin by burying their dead. And that's the place where development needed to begin, as opposed to, well, I'm in a very sacred place today. We're in the state of Washington, where I'm sure so many of these roads and el desarrollo of this state, the developed state, is paved over the bones of the sacred. And we began this group, and it was really interesting that, like in many places, people aren't really interested in true development, or their development is based on financial and well, it's restrained by time and finances. A 2-year project or a 1-year project, and we started organizing kids in a different way, not like with the criteria of their poverty or their suffering. And right from the beginning, that poverty or their suffering, their bad story, would not be criteria for their advancement or this development. And you've seen it like so many so many organizations, like, they want kids to look poor, and the poorer they look, the better the donation. And that would be our criteria. Our criteria would begin with the demands that our new community would make of them: responsibility, discipline, and generosity. And then how much you're willing to put in. So not only we were gathering the remains of people, but I bring a bicycle. And then the Tamarindo begins with a bicycle and a boxing ring. And the boxing ring, kids were really violent. And we made a choice to work with kids because so many of the combatants were in another place. And so we began literacy programs, and but everything based on Dorothy Day's Friday night meeting. It all begins there, where clarification of thought, of our own self-reflection, faith in action, and, if you will, the Tamarindo Foundation becomes a stone soup of ideas. And we all know the story of the stone soup, and it's told in many languages in many ways, but the stone soup is, we begin with the rock in the middle of a village, and we begin to invite people to come and see the stone becoming a soup. And of course they say things like, wow, a stone soup, how interesting. Wouldn't it be better if you throw a little garlic in? And then, I have some of that at my house. And they go and they bring the garlic. And then someone else says, wow, garlic and stone. Okay, wouldn't it be better with a little escarole? They run and get the escarole. And on and on and on. And I think it's a lot of this miracle they talk about in the New Testament, a Jesus story, where he's there teaching along the banks of the river. And, he's an amazing teacher, And it's a different kind of teaching, because it's like they're feeling love, And then they're there all day. It's so good. They're getting this great vibe. No one's telling this gospel story this way anywhere. But you're getting this is the hippie version of it. They're getting this great vibe, this is pre-Burning Man, right? And thousands of people. And finally, there's always some practical. You have to have a practical person in every community, and the practical person says, "Hey, Jesus, this is too much. How these people need to eat? It's getting dark." He says, "Bring me a couple of fish. Bring me a couple of loaves of bread, pan, And then he breaks it, shares it, and then I've learned in El Salvador that campesinos never go anywhere without food. And it's always hidden, because they don't want. I'm sure it's this way all over the world. And then they're watching this example of love, and then they start pulling out their stuff. We used to go on these trips, and there was this guy, Julio Enriquez, and Julio would go on these trips, and all of a sudden he'd have this little bag, and he'd pull out like a whole chicken, and it was like. But this is what the loaves and the fishes story is really about. It's like Julio Enriquez pulling out his whole chicken and sharing it. And that would be the basis of the Tamarindo Foundation, that we would be like this place where...
This catalyst that turns like self-protection into sharing.
Yeah. Yeah, love. I mean, what is it? Ignatius says that love in words is nothing. Love is action. Love is giving, and it goes back to the whole purpose of really what my life was supposed to be. I watched my grandfather do that, I watched Father Berrigan do that, and I watched those great Jesuits that I knew do that. They shared what they had, and not necessarily they were, they're known as the leaders. Jesus is known as the big leader, in some circles. But he was part of the community, right? And so the Tamarina would do that, and of course the demands and it's interesting. I've been in Latin America now for 40 years, and to watch so many NGOs that are really based on a charity model and how they have hurt us. I remember in Tijuana there was a place they called it El Dompe. El Dompe. In northern Mexico at the border, everything is Spanglish.
Yeah.
And but there was just to be church groups that would come over, and there was a dump, right? And they would come and they'd bring like dolls for the girls and G.I. Joes for the boys. There was even a guy that used to show up there and throw coins.
Jesus.
No, this gets crazier. But again, this stuff happens even with fancy, multi-million-dollar NGOs. Pretty much the same model. So eventually people are going, wait a minute. Saturday and Sunday, the gringo church people come. So people start setting up shop at El Dompe, their weekend home, right? To set up a champa because the stuff's coming. And that's repeated, year after year after year and at many different levels. And we wouldn't be that we weren't about stuff, that it would be about, that everyone would have to, as we used to say during the war, echar su granito. Everyone's got to put something in. Stone soup, right?
Yeah.
Everyone's got to put something in, or as Father Grande, that beautiful song. And it was wonderful. They sang it for me at this mass in Los Angeles recently. It says, Vamos todos al banquete. Let's all come to the banquet. Vamos todos al banquete, a la mesa de la creación, to the table of creation. Cada cual, every person, cada cual con su taburete. Everyone would have their own bench, their own place, su puesto y su misión, their place and their mission. So everyone's required to have a mission.
That's what this whole show is about.
There's
it.
the song. Well,
Yeah.
we're supposed to get together for the fans out there. Yeah, I know you have millions. It goes like this. It goes, and I'm a terrible singer, but vamos todos al banquete, a la mesa de la creación, cada cual con su taburete y un puesto y su misión. That's it. So that's what our foundation's about. Like, okay, and it was Father Grande, right? He says, "Here's a table. You're invited. Bring your chair, loaves and fishes, but be ready, because there'll be responsibility, and you have a mission, you have a purpose. You just can't be there. What do we say in El Salvador? De balde, and you just can't be. You just can't come and hang out, And I think it was Malcolm X when he talked about in his biography, which is an amazing book. He talks about how he wondered why white people were always thought that ping pong tables were really essential to every African American neighborhood. Like that was it. Just give them a ping pong table and everyone will be happy. It's silly, but that's a lot of development, right? We bring things. We currently have a president in El Salvador right now that I think he's at the end. I think he's appeasing people with things. an amusement park, a box of starchy food, a soccer stadium if he ever builds that. But so our foundation is very different. So our demands were discipline, service, solidarity, and community engagement, action, praxis. And we currently work in everything: health, wellness, education, micro-business development, gender advancement. And one of the great things about after our many, many years of in our foundation is our leadership is homegrown. So 30 years in, our foundation is this year 31 years old. The leadership, men and women, all came from the ground up, and they run it, and I think that I believe in the Salvadoran dream, and in the sense that Salvadoran men and women should be able to discern their own futures, that our foundation provides spaces where they develop habit. I was with a very wise woman the last few mornings. She talks about her 5 habits. So I think there's a process of developing positive habits, discipline of life, technical, academic skill, and I think at this point in time, in 2022, that's where we're at right now. Numbers are always hard for me. There's not one young person in our community that can say they're poor, that they don't have an opportunity, or they can't live in a safe a community, because that's what the foundation has achieved. And I say foundation, our community. We're the Tamarindo community first and foremost. But that's where we're at right now. That's where we're at right now.
Hi everyone, this is Martin, your producer. I just want to take a minute to thank our guests for joining us today, and also to thank you all for listening. 10,000 Heroes is brought to you by Momentum Lab, our year-long coaching program. Let me introduce you to the team. Pierre does our artwork, DJ Plainview composed our theme music, and I handled all the editing and sound design. Also, if you like the show, please follow it, rate it, tell all your friends, and reach out to us somehow. We love communication. All of this really help us make the impact we want to make. And now we're closing down this episode with a word from our main sponsor, who also happens to be our host, Anchor.
And now a message from our sponsor, me again. 10,000 Heroes is brought to you by Momentum Lab. I normally refer to Momentum Lab as a coaching program or a goal accelerator, but it's really more like a master's degree in life. When you join Momentum Lab, we help you get crystal clear on what it is you actually want, who you want to be, what you want to do, and how you want to contribute. And then we get into all the painful details of what has been blocking you this whole time. And then we give you the knowledge, the tools, and the support you need to get there. Sometimes that's a spreadsheet, sometimes it's a mindset hack, sometimes it's a lecture, and sometimes it's a hug. Our only attachment is to your higher self. So, when you're ready to be the next version of yourself, in your business, for your family, or just for your own sense of fulfillment, drop me a line.